Good evening. If you could take your seats, we'll get started. My name is William Weitzer. I'm the Executive Director of the Leo Baeck Institute, and I'm excited to see all of you here, although the lights just went down so I can't see you anymore. On behalf of the Leo Baeck Institute and the AJC, I welcome you to the Center for Jewish History for this round table. I would like to recognize Michael Schmidt, who's been my colleague in planning this, and he will come up at the end and you'll see him. I'd also like to recognize the LBI president, Dr. Ronald Sobel is here, and even though they can't hear me, I want to thank my staff and Michael's staff, and so someone can tell them that I did that, because we've had a day's worth of activities, and they've been 3 places at once and made everything appear, including the flowers and the water bottles, so it's a group effort. For those of you who don't know us, the Leo Baeck Institute was founded in 1955, and the mission that we had then lives strong today, and that is to preserve and promote the history and culture of German-speaking Jewry. And as such, we have arguably the best archival collection of German Jewry, as well as a fantastic library and an art collection. And many people see our role in preserving this, and it has been much of our role, is to support scholarship and books. And in years past, much of that has been about that history. But I really believe that that history comes alive when you talk about all parts of the history, which include what happened before the Nazi rise to power, what happened during the Holocaust, and yes, what happened today and between World War II and today. And tonight, I'm gratified that this program does exactly that. Of course, the AJC always deals with contemporary issues, and I'm really pleased to join them in doing that. So let me talk to you a bit about Minister Maas, who was named to his post as Federal Minister of Justice and Consumer Protection in December of 2013. After earning his law degree, Minister Maas has held a number of positions in the Social Democratic Party. Early in his career, he served in environmental positions in his home state, Saarland, including serving as Minister for Environment, Energy, and Transport. What really pleases me is that this study had been going on prior to his coming into office, and when he came into office, he heard about the study and immediately embraced it, to the extent that he said, when it comes to the United States to talk about the study, that he wanted to be here. And so we are honored that he is here. The order will be that you will hear from Minister Maas, and then Susie Jaffe, who is active in the AGC, will introduce our panel. Then you will hear from our panel. And please stay to the end, because there'll be a wonderful food buffet when we're all done. So thank you very much.
Mr. Weitzer, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Marwell, Professor Whitman, Professor Görtemaker, Professor Safferling, friends of the Leo Baeck Institute, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak with you and for your interest in tonight's topic. I was very moved to find out that some Holocaust survivors are with us this evening. The fact that you have come to hear the Justice Minister of Germany honors and humbles me. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I have been in the building all day, and I have had many interesting discussions. This has been possible because the Leo Baeck Institute and the American Jewish Committee bring together people who are interested in Germany, its history, and its present as well. The Leo Baeck Institute works on preserving the history of Judaism in Germany, and by doing so, it also promotes new German Jewish life. Meanwhile, the Jewish communities in Germany again have more than 100,000 members. 25 years ago, the number had less than 30,000. The German government is very happy about this development, and we are doing everything we can to promote Jewish life in Germany. This is why we support the work of the Leo Baeck Institute. But in addition to institutions and organizations, we need people who take on this work with great commitment. One of these people is Professor Michael Brenner. He is the international president of the Leo Baeck Institute, and he is a professor of Jewish history and culture at the University of Munich. In view of his great work, the President of the Federal Republic of Germany has bestowed the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany upon Professor Brenner. It was my great pleasure to present that award this afternoon, and I would like to congratulate him once again. Ladies and gentlemen, just recently a new film opened in German movie theaters. It is set in Frankfurt in 1958, and it paints a good picture of the atmosphere in West Germany at that time. The film shows the reconstruction following the war and the West German economic miracle. It shows that peace and prosperity have once again come to Germany, and it exposed the abyss behind the facade of normality. For example, we see the respected teacher who divides up his class for the day's lesson. Right, left, right, left. Later we find out that the same man stood at the ramp in Auschwitz and selected who went directly into the gas chamber. Right, left, right, left. This film is called The Labyrinth of Lies and tells the story leading up to the Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt. The film shows the ignorance of German post-war society about the Holocaust and its victims. It shows the unwillingness of the German justice system to investigate the perpetrators of Nazi crimes. And it shows the hostility and even hate encountered by those few prosecutors who attempted to bring the perpetrators to justice. Ladies and gentlemen, in the 20th century, the German justice system twice incurred a heavy burden of guilt. The first time was its participation in the crimes of the Nazis. These included assembly line-style death sentences and the arbitrary treatment of everyone not considered to be part of the, quote, people's community, unquote, of the Nazis. This part of history has meanwhile been studied extensively. The broader public has been aware for many years that the justice system participated in the Nazi regime of repression. Many justice institutions have already addressed their role during the Nazi dictatorship. For example, the German lawyers. Tomorrow at the New York City Bar, I will be opening an exhibition put on by the German Federal Bar Association. Its title is Lawyers Without Rights, and it deals with the persecution of Jewish lawyers, and they lost their profession. Some were able to flee to foreign countries, but many were murdered. These Nazi crimes were the first legal and moral transgression But there's a second transgression as well, and it happened after the war. The West German justice system did not prosecute the large majority of the Nazi criminals, rather it let them go. By doing so, it also denied justice to the victims of the Nazis. One reason for this was the high personal continuity in the system. For the most part, the judges and the prosecutors of the Nazi regime of terror were also the judges and prosecutors in the post-war West Germany. This second transgression of the German justice system has not been the subject of much academic studies. We want to change this, and this is why the Federal Justice Ministry started the Rosenburg Project. The Rosenburg was an imposing building in Bonn, where the West German Justice Ministry was located in the 1950s and the 1960s. We want to know how people in the ministry dealt with the Nazi past back then. Specifically, we want to know how they dealt with the past of the people who worked there. Did the lawyers have to actively hide their Nazi past, or did people simply not want to know about it? Were there networks of old Nazis in the ministry who consciously sabotaged the criminal prosecution of their Nazi comrades? Or was the attitude that they needed to put the past behind them and make a fresh start, consistent with the mainstream of society? In order to find out this and much more, the Justice Ministry has established an independent academic commission. It's headed by Manfred Görtemaker and Christoph Safferling. Manfred is an historian and Christoph is an expert in criminal law. To facilitate the commission's work, the ministry has decided that for the first time, all historical files will be opened and available to the researchers. This will allow them to review the personal records of 280 important jurists in Germany. We have already become familiar with some prominent cases. For example, there is Eduard Treher, the high-level civil servant who influenced German criminal law for decades. Today, we know that during the Nazi dictatorship, that man was a prosecutor who participated in imposing horrendous death sentences. In 1968, Treher worked up a legislative amendment while working at the Justice Ministry. But there was something that nobody noticed until the amended law came into force. The effect of the amendment was that overnight the statute of limitations has expired on the crimes of many Nazis. Pending investigations had to be determined, and new ones could not be initiated. Were the effects of this amendment merely an unintended consequence, or did an old Nazi jurist purposely manipulate the law? This is only one example of us wanting to find out what effects the official Nazi past truly had on the Justice Ministry policies. Ladies and gentlemen, the crimes of the Nazis and how the justice system dealt with them after the war are not topics only for experts and academics. We are striving to carry this debate into a broader public as well. For that reason, the Independent Academic Commission is dedicated to the concept of public history. In addition to research activities, in addition to working with the documents and in the archives, we want to stimulate public debate as well. This includes events with contemporary witness and as well as jurists of today's generation. It includes discussions with school classes and university students, and it also includes even with experts both within Germany and abroad. I'm very grateful to the Leo Baeck Institute that we have been given the opportunity to present the Rosenburg Project here today. Of course, the USA play an important role in research as well. Many persecuted people and survivors of the Holocaust found a new home here. One example was a 15-year-old Polish orphan. He was liberated from the Flossenburg concentration camp in 1945. An American officer took him with him to the USA, and that boy has meanwhile become an old man. He's Jack Terry, born in 1930, and he is quoted in the Süddeutsche Zeitung 27th of October this year. Today he lives in New York, and he says, "I felt welcome in America. That was the most important thing that helped me turn back into a human being." Witnesses play an important role. In the United States, policies are important as well. Recently, I read in the New York Times that apparently 1,000 former Nazis were used as spies by American secret services. During the Cold War, was recruiting agents more important than punishing former Nazis? This question will certainly interest the researchers as well. I'm sure that our researchers will gain many new impulses from our meetings here in New York, and I'm very much looking forward to the coming panel discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, the new film I mentioned earlier ends with the opening of probably the most important court proceeding in German history, the Auschwitz trial, which took place in Frankfurt am Main from 1963 to 1965. At least a few Nazi criminals from the concentration camps were brought to justice. But its greatest success was it brought historical truths to light. Since then, nobody has been able to deny the genocide against the Jews of Europe. Since that trial, we Germans know what crimes were committed in Auschwitz and in the other camps. This was a very important step to take after years of silence, suppression, and lies. The man who took Auschwitz to court was Fritz Bauer, prosecutor general of Hesse at that time. And the member of the Social Democratic Party, and due to his Jewish heritage, he himself had been persecuted by the Nazis. The new film is dedicated to Fritz Bauer and serves as a memorial to him. To preserve his memory and his heritage, this year I have established the Fritz Bauer Study Prize. With it, I hope to especially encourage young lawyers to become familiar with Fritz Bauer, the Holocaust, and the Auschwitz trial. Ladies and gentlemen, remembrance and memorials are not an end in themselves. We honor the victims of the past by holding them in our memory. But we also look into the future. Today, the German government is committed by fostering Jewish life in Germany. We stand steadfastly against every form of anti-Semitism, and we have been linked in close partnership with Israel for many years. These are all consequences from our history. We have been able to draw these consequences because we are aware of the historical truth. Only because everyone in Germany knows that Auschwitz and the gas chambers existed is the fight against anti-Semitism and our friendship with Israel an integral part of the German raison d'etre. This must be preserved into the future. And we therefore need to ensure that the generations that come after us are familiar with German history. This is what makes the Rosenburg Project so important. When the final report is completed next year, we will see what deficits exist in the past. At the same time, this gives rise to an obligation for the future. As we go forward, every young German must know what happened in Auschwitz. Nazi crimes must never be forgotten. Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once said, "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards." I think that he is right, and Germany's dealing with its Pazis Nas proves it. Looking back helps us find the way forward. Ladies and gentlemen, in closing, please allow me to express my dismay about the terrible attack in Jerusalem. This attack on a house of prayer disrespects all of humanity. Violence of this kind has no place in the world. We are profoundly shocked by this tragedy, and our hearts go out to the families and the friends of the victims. Thank you very much.
It is hard to see from up here. Thank you, Minister Maas, for being with us on such an incredibly cold New York City evening. And thank you also for your candid and very thoughtful remarks. Very much appreciated. Good evening. I'm Susie Jaffe, a member of the AJC Board of New York, as well as a member of our national board. I have the pleasure of co-chairing our New York City Germany team, which is part of our diplomatic outreach effort. In this capacity, I'm particularly delighted to be here this evening. As the premier global Jewish advocacy organization, AJC regularly engages with diplomats from around the world. Our relationship with the German diplomatic corps here in New York City and other US cities and in Berlin has continued to deepen, and we are delighted that there are a number of our New York-based German friends participating in the program this evening. Joining us this evening is a panel of experts who we just heard about, who will discuss the Justice Ministry's study. It included Nazi sympathizers, includes, because it isn't complete yet, in the German ministry post-World War II, which I think is something that we all need to spend a little more time focusing on. Moderating the panel is Dr. David Marwell, Director of the Museum of Jewish Heritage and former Chief of Investigative Research at the U.S. Department of Justice. I'm sure you have a lot to talk with the Minister about. And our distinguished panelists include Professor Manfred Gertemacher, who's professor of history at the University of Potsdam and co-chair of this study, Professor Christoph Safferling, professor of law at the University in Marburg, at the far end, who's the other co-chair, and Professor Rebecca Whitman, professor of history at the University of Toronto. In your booklets, you'll find a much more lengthy bio, and we figured that would be a better way for you to find out more about these people. So I'm going to turn the program over to Dr. Marwell.
Thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for coming tonight. And I want to thank particularly Billy Weitzer and Michael Schmidt for the invitation to moderate this panel. I was honored to be asked, and I feel privileged to share the stage with such a distinguished panel of colleagues, Manfred Gordemacher, Christoph Stafferling, and Rebecca Whitman. Our time this evening is necessarily short, and I'm glad that Billy dangled the offer of dinner afterwards, which will guarantee that you'll stay to the end. My goal tonight as your advocate, as the audience advocate, is to make sure that by the time you leave here, you'll have a reasonably good idea of what this study is all about. And I'll do my best to tease that out of our panelists to give you some broader context and some of my own personal experience. But because we may not be successful in answering all of your questions, we're going to allow you to ask some questions. And we're going to do that in the form of written questions. So some of LBI staff will be handing out cards and pencils, and you can write your questions. They'll be delivered up here, and we will try to get to as many as we can. Before I pose some questions and allow our panelists to speak, I thought I would take the prerogative of the moderator to make a few comments about my own thoughts about this study and why it's particularly important for me. Early in my career, I worked as a historian for the Department of Justice, the Office of Special Investigations, which was the office within the department that was charged with investigating Nazi war criminals living in the United States. I spent a great deal of time in Germany, working with German justice and police officials in connection with our investigations. I would spend long, long weeks traveling from one prosecutor's office to the other to review their files. Our German colleagues helped us to locate witnesses. They facilitated the interview of witnesses. They provided the fruits of their own very detailed investigations into Nazi crimes that were relevant to the cases that we were investigating. They facilitated our efforts in manifold ways, and always through the proper and formal judicial assistance requests that were passed on from government to government. I thought when preparing for today, I looked back and just thought about the different offices, prosecutors that I visited, and the different cases I was working on, and I came up with a list that reads like a tour of Germany. I worked with the prosecutors in Frankfurt, in Hanover, in Dortmund, in Stuttgart, in Essen, in Munich, in Lübeck, in Hamburg, in Schwäbisch Gmünd, in Cologne, and of course in Ludwigsburg. Ludwigsburg was a remarkable institution, still is, I believe, today, known as the Zentralstelle. It has a much longer name, but everyone called it the Zentralstelle. And this office was responsible for coordinating the local prosecutions of Nazi war crimes, and they had assembled a remarkable archive of interrogations and of memos and of investigations. So it was a very useful source for me. And there I met remarkable German justice officials like Adalbert Ruckel and Alfred Streim, who were, in my view, remarkable men. My relationship with the prosecutors whom I dealt with and the policemen with whom I dealt were extremely positive. I witnessed firsthand a unambiguously passionate commitment to justice, but I also witnessed a palpable frustration on the part of these dedicated prosecutors and police officers with the limits of German criminal law, of how it was interpreted and enforced in the case of the crimes against Nazi war criminals. I was struck by the scale of their activity. In one sense, rather modest, if you think about the post-war number of trials against Nazi war criminals, 6,000, I think, that actually came to trial or thereabouts, and 100,000 investigations that were carried on to some extent. I thought about the paradox between these passionate advocates of justice and the limitations of the law with which they worked. They were remarkable in their effort to enforce the law, which is an admirable thing, but were prohibited in some way from being effective in their true goal, which was the pursuit of justice. we'll talk about this in a few minutes. Much to my surprise, in the last several years, there's been a significant shift in the way that Nazi crimes are being handled by the German justice establishment, beginning with the Demjanjuk trial a few years ago, and there may be some antecedents to that which could be discussed. An entirely new view or strategy and a new legal theory seems to be animating the pursuit of justice for Nazi crimes in Germany. And we'll talk about that. Why this change came so late and why it was not possible earlier may have much to do with the question of continuity in the institutions of German justice, continuity between the Third Reich and the Bundesrepublik, which is, of course, at the heart of the ambitious study now underway in Germany. Before I go to a discussion of the issues that I've just raised, I think it's important for you to hear from the people who are conducting this project, to give us a context of what this project is about, the scope of it, and how they're going about it. So if I could ask Manfred to begin, and we have some, are we set with the visuals? Yeah. Okay. And I should say that I've encouraged and will encourage my colleagues on the panel to make this a free-flowing discussion. So if anyone has a question they want to interrupt, that's fine with me.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me be as brief as possible. Our commission was established in January 2012 by the Federal Minister of Justice. Our main task is to find out how far-reaching the continuity, the personal continuity in particular is between the Reich Ministry of Justice and the institution that was established in 1949. Now we know, of course, that a significant number of personnel working for the ministry after 1949 have been deeply involved in the previous Nazi regime. Up to 90% of the ministry's senior employees have been members of the Nazi Party or affiliated organizations and have acted as judges, prosecutors, or civil servants during the Third Reich. And even at the West German Federal High Court in Karlsruhe, the number of judges who held high posts during the Nazi period also exceeded 80% in the 1950s and 1960s. At the same time, those who had worked at most senior posts in the Nazi regime did not have to be afraid of any consequences. Instead, they formed networks and helped one another in the continuation of their legal careers within the developing system of West German federal justice after 1949, and even within the federal justice ministry itself. So there really obviously is a problem, and what our project now is all about is to look at the files in the Ministry of Justice and also at the files in the Federal Archives of the Federal Republic to find out what specifically these people in the Ministry of Justice did and to what extent their past also affected legislation in the Federal Republic.
Just a brief interruption. Maybe put this slide that's on the board into perspective for...
Yes. What you see here, first of all, of course, is the Rosenburg, which is quite an impressive building. I would like to go into some details now. When you look at the selection of personnel after 1949, we are dealing mainly here with two people, first of all, and that is the Minister of Justice himself, Thomas Saylor, and his State Secretary, Walter Strauss. Now, both, and that is interesting, both had some Jewish background. Dehler was married to a Jewish woman. Walter Strauss' parents were Jewish. They were deported to Theresienstadt, where they also died. Therefore, it is all the more surprising that these responsible people at the top of the ministry hired so many personnel which had a background in the Nazi regime, but they obviously did. So this is full of paradoxes, first of all. But on the other hand, it is also interesting, and this is important, not only how many people in the ministry were working for, or had been working for the Reich Ministry of Justice or in other Nazi organizations, we also try to look at what they actually did in the Federal Ministry of Justice, because that's probably more important than just looking at where they came from. And here, of course, we have to ask why so many Nazi criminals were released early or were not punished at all. So the passing of amnesty laws is a very important aspect here, so that by 1958, almost all former Nazi criminals who had been put in jail were already released. 1958, so very early, if they were punished at all. Thirdly, we ask what role the ministry played in the slow rehabilitation of Nazi victims. And this also, of course, is a very, very crucial point, and may be that those people who had a Nazi past themselves also helped to prevent a quicker rehabilitation. So the real question is, was there kind of a culture of either silence or forgiveness within the ministry with regard to Nazi crimes?
It should be stressed that your investigation, you're in the middle of it. You haven't completed, you don't have your final conclusion.
We are right in the middle of it. These are the questions that we have. And so we want to find out not only about the continuity of personnel in the ministry, but also about the paradox that on the one hand, you obviously had a great number, a significant number of Nazi personnel in the ministry after 1949, and the number in top position even increases. Whereas in the early 1950s, you have a significant number of heads of the departments who have a Nazi past. At the end of the 1960s, all heads of the departments had a Nazi past. So due to promotion within the ministry. So this is really crucial. And at the same time, and that's the paradox, the Federal Republic of Germany became a democratic state. So why did that happen? So this paradox, I think, is the most interesting question that we have to raise here.
I wonder if it says something about the legal profession. Maybe we can talk about that. So, you're passing on to Christoph now?
Christoph now will talk about individual cases, I think, and the structure of the ministry, and give us some results of our research.
Well, thank you. After I found my microphone, now I can speak to you and get into further detail of some biographies, just to give you a little insight of what we're actually dealing with. So what you see here is obviously the notorious Roland Freisler at the People's Court, the Volksgerichtshof. And what we have to deal with is sort of people who helped, being jurists, being lawyers, prosecutors, judges, who helped this system of injustice, with Freisler at the top, if you want, to be established, to be executed throughout the German Reich. So it's very much the saying that was put down by the American judges in the Nuremberg justice trial, where they said the dagger of the assassin was concealed beneath the robe of the jurists, is very much that what we're looking for. And it's very much that we have to say this is crimes against humanity. It's not about bending and flexing the law. It's about murdering. It's about crimes against humanity. So when we look at the careers of the people who were then employed by the Federal Department of Justice, we have to look at what they did previous to 1945. Now, how we do this, I know this is a very bad picture, but it should give you an impression of how we actually proceed. What you see here is an organizational chart of the ministry.
What year is the chart?
This is 1957, okay? Just arbitrarily chosen, it's 1957. You have at top the minister, it was Minister Schaffer at the time. You have Walter Strauss, his deputy, the state secretary. Still Walter Strauss, you just saw a picture of him a minute ago. And then you have the individual departments here. This is the general administrative department, and then department number 1, 2, 3, and 4. Number 1 is responsible for civil law. Number 2, criminal law. Number 3, economy law. Number 4, everything else. Public law in particular, and international law, everything else was put into this number 4. What I'm going to talk about now is what I sort of marked with this red lines. Because I'm a criminal lawyer, I tend to talk about criminal law and criminal lawyers. So let us focus into this department, and it looks like that. So this is, again, you see what you just saw between these red lines. And what I marked here on the side It's their former infiltration into the Nazi system and what they did pre-1945. And you see that all of them have had a post as a jurist before 1945 in the Nazi system. All but two. It's here Dr. Gosrau and here Mr. Schmartloch. Well, that I haven't named a former employment in the Nazi system doesn't mean that I didn't have one. I simply didn't have a chance to look at their files yet. So we'll see where that comes out. You see the top of the department, and I just want to go roughly through it and point to very few people to give you just an impression. At the top is one Dr. Schaffer. He was a consultant in the Reichsministry of Justice, starting very early from 1933 onwards. And then we have here Dr. Schwalm, junior consultant in the Reichsministry of Justice, very important, the Department of Legal Education. Legal education was centralized in what was previously a federal system. It was centralized, and the Reichsministry was organizing legal education, and you can imagine how that looked like. And then we have, of course, Eduard Dreher. We'll talk about him in detail later on as well. The person that Minister Maas has already spoken about. He was the first public prosecutor at the special court in Innsbruck, so not an ordinary court, a special court, the special Nazi court. Freisler called them the tank troops of the judiciary, the Nazi judiciary. Then you have another person, junior consultant in the Reichsministry of Justice. He was a splendid lawyer. He had the best exam in Bavaria, in the state of Bavaria. And from this oral exam onwards, he was taken up to Berlin to work for the Reichsministry of Justice. And then you have another group, which you can see throughout the ministry, military judges. And all of you have looked into what military judges did in the Nazi regime, can only be horrified, really. Some 35,000 death penalties were executed, and everybody who worked in the context of the military justice system had blood on his hands. So on the other side, you see, you also see different jobs that they held. I don't want to go into further detail in this, but it's, I think, a quite impressive sketch of how the criminal law department looked in 1957. Now, I give you a picture here of Josef Schaffer, who was the head of the department at that time. And interestingly enough, this is what you see here is a little picture from his personal files, right? So this is what we're working with. And you see here at the bottom, you see affiliations with the NSDAP, the Nazi Party, and other party subsections. And you see here, he wasn't a member of the Nazi Party. Well, he wasn't a member of the Nazi Party, but does that mean that he didn't have a Nazi past, a Nazi story? As you just heard, he was working in the Ministry of Justice, and later on, actually, he was also working as a military judge during the war. So, but he didn't have a membership in the Nazi Party. And this obviously after the war in 1945, in 1949 when he came to the ministry, he always stressed that point. Said, "Oh, I wasn't a member of the Nazi Party," and they almost treated him like a resistant fighter. What they didn't know, but what we know because we looked at the files, is that from 1937 onwards, obviously because he wasn't a member of the party, his career stopped. He wasn't promoted to the new step in his career. So what did he try to do? Desperately, he tried to get into the party. He wrote application after application, letter after letter, to be admitted to the Nazi Party. And they said, "Oh no, you come from a Catholic background, and you have worked, as a student, you have been in a Catholic."
And it wasn't so easy to get into the party after. So
No. It wasn't. In the end, he wasn't admitted to the Nazi Party, but he desperately wanted to get into it. Interestingly enough, by the way, what made it even worse maybe afterwards, he was then, after the war, working for the Economic Council in East Berlin, in the Soviet zone. And in 1947, he was, because of his Nazi past, he was incarcerated, he was jailed by the Soviet authorities, first in Hohenschönhausen, later Stasi prison, and then in the former concentration camp Sachsenhausen, until in 1949 he came back to the Federal Republic of Germany. So he was sort of victimized by the communists, and this raised his credibility when he came back to the Federal Republic of Germany immensely. So that's with Josef Schaffer. And then you see a picture here of Eduard Dreher, which we have already heard about by Minister Maas. And I just want to give you also a little story here. He was a member of the Nazi Party from 1937 onwards. And here you can see the denazification process and the results of that. He was categorized as a Mitläufer, a follower, category 4. So that would enable him to continue to be working as a lawyer in Germany. It's a very low category. So he was the first prosecutor at the special court in Innsbruck. And in 1954, when he just had started to work for the Federal Ministry of Justice, he was to promote to become a federal judge. And then the first allegations arose that he actually was in Innsbruck, was working as a prosecutor, and he was responsible for death penalties. As a prosecutor, he would call for the death penalty for really minor cases. And there was one case brought up. So by the end of the day, because of that, he was not promoted to become a federal judge. And indeed, inside the ministry, an inquiry took place, and they wrote to the ministry in Austria and asked for the files of this case from Innsbruck to be transferred to Berlin, to Bonn, sorry. That's what they did, and then they decided that he would not become a federal judge. What happened instead? He was promoted inside the ministry. So the interesting thing then was that in the course of the next 10 years, from 54 until 64 maybe, 3 of such cases became known, became public, so that he had, for minor crimes, applied for the death penalty and saved, and the people got executed. So we went to Innsbruck and looked at the files, and we found 17 of similar cases where he actually applied for the death penalty, and the people were sentenced to death. So there's a considerable gap, and I question myself, of course. The ministry could have done so in 1954, right? I mean, they could have gone and asked the Austrian authorities to hand over all the files and look at what Dreher was really involved in. Now, in these 17 cases I was naming, there are cases, of course, in which there is a murder in the background. But maybe I can give you a little story. It's one of the cases that really shocked me the most of all what I read in Innsbruck. So that is a murder case. There is a policeman. He surprises someone who's about to steal a bike and wants to arrest him. And this person, for whatever reason, takes up a knife and stabs the police officer to death. So far, so good. He was caught with a bloody knife in his hand. From that moment on, until he was sentenced to death, you have 10 hours. 10 hours. So are we talking about a trial? Are we talking about a fair trial? Are we talking about any chance of this person, even if he was guilty, and even if at the end death penalty was, at that time the sentence for that kind of crime? But still, he didn't stand a chance to tell his story, and everybody who has to do with criminal law knows that there's always a story. There's always must be the possibility to tell a story and to be heard to before the court. So this man didn't have. And Dreher was the prosecutor who was doing this. He was forcing this. And the same man in the 50s, 60s, and way up to the 90s wrote this commentary which was so important and influenced the criminal law in the Federal Republic of Germany as no other has done. I think I want to leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you very much. Startling, the continuity in terms of personnel. And I want to turn to Rebecca to help us understand how that continuity may have had an impact on the pursuit of Nazi war criminals in the post-war period. This is your expertise.
Yes, thank you. I like the word paradox that you used because it animates almost all of my research and my interest in the subject, which is basically picking up where you leave off, looking into the 60s, 70s, 80s, and now most recently the Demjanjuk trial. But my first book was about the Auschwitz trial, which has been mentioned today. And again, paradox is very important here because, as Minister Maas mentioned, it is really seen as one of these watershed moments in terms of public consciousness in Germany, and it was. For the first time, people were really hearing what Auschwitz was. On the other hand, the more research that I did into the trial itself, the clearer it became to me that this trial had absolutely dismal results. And as David mentioned, approximately 100,000 people investigated, approximately 6,000 brought to trial. Of those, 124 are sentenced to life in prison in the West German justice system. So this is something that I also started to investigate, why this was happening. And a large part of it has to do with the kind of law that was used. Christoph mentioned these were crimes against humanity. They were not treated as such, according to the West German justice system. In fact, crimes against humanity was completely off the table. And the kind of law that was used was the everyday German penal code. And for very specific reasons. It had existed since 1871. The ministry wanted to show that these crimes had been crimes from beginning to end, and that Nazi crimes could be dealt with afterwards because of the fact that they had always been, these charges had always existed. So they used murder, manslaughter, and the regular penal code. The problem with this then was the way that these were defined. And just very briefly, for the lay audience, some of you may be most familiar with how the criminal justice system works and what Murder 1 and Murder 2 is from watching Law and Order and other shows like that. It was certainly for me, thinking about it, Murder 1, malice aforethought, intent, Murder 2, perhaps less so. In the German justice system at this particular time, definitions were used which were much, much more subjective. So you not only had to prove intent and malice aforethought, you had to also prove what that intent was in order to convict someone as a perpetrator of murder to get them sentenced to life in prison. And that could be sadism, lust for killing, cruelty, and other base motives, treachery, various different things, but you had to prove the actual intent. Other base motives was defined for the purpose of Nazi trials as anti-Semitism or racial hatred, but very hard to prove because someone could simply say, I wasn't an anti-Semite. So they ended up with a focus on sadism, lust for killing, and showing that those people who exhibited these things could then be convicted of murder. And the frustration that you mentioned is so clear in the Auschwitz trial because Fritz Bauer, who Minister Maas mentioned, was in charge of this trial. And as far as he was concerned, if you worked at Auschwitz, you were a murderer. And he wanted that to be the case, but the legal system against which he was working did not let that happen at all. Instead, the people who were convicted of murder were those who had gone above and beyond their orders. It was a legitimization of Nazi laws and rules and regulations in order to show that someone had engaged in excessive cruelty, excessive sadism. And the people that they used on the stand to prove that some of the defendants had engaged in this were former SS judges, specifically someone named Conrad Morgan, who is a colleague in the post-war period, very well respected, who had been a judge who had gone to Auschwitz to investigate excessive brutality and corruption. And that is where the evidence came out against many at the Auschwitz trial, that they had engaged in this kind of excessive cruelty. So, 6 people end up being convicted of murder, and not the highest level ranking guards from the camp, not the adjutant who was the second in command. They had a commander, but he died before the trial began. Those who were at sort of lower levels, who were sadists, who were terrifying, who had nicknames, the Butcher of Birkenau, and who legitimately would be terrifying as the murderers in our midst. But the rest of them did not seem dangerous outside of the camp setting, and so by and large they go free. My questions became then very quickly, why? Why is the law defined in such a subjective way, as opposed to he who pulls the trigger, it's he who wills the trigger to be pulled? And when you start to look and question, you see that this continuity in personnel becomes the largest problem. And it gets worse, it doesn't get better. after 1968, the criminal reform, which basically turned an entire investigation of the whole main Reich security service. It fell apart on what was considered a technicality. We're starting to look at this now and think, not so much a technicality, perhaps purposeful on Dreher's part, which is why I'm so grateful for the work that they're doing, where they can actually look into these files and see just how influential some of these people were. The law is not inanimate. It is being created by people. And why are they creating this kind of law? Well, it becomes very clear that in the post-war period, you have virtually no sentences, no prosecutions of judges or lawyers. 2 before 1949, none thereafter. And why is that? Because they are remaining in place. And in the 70s and in the 80s, trials, people start losing interest in the Nazi trials. The sentences become even smaller. And you see this, and this is something I'm working on now, in the stark contrast between the trials of the Baader-Meinhof gang, the RAF terrorists in the 70s, and the trials of Nazis in the 70s, specifically the Majdanek trial and the Stammheim trial, both happening in the 70s, where the Stammheim trial is the trial of the 4 main Baader-Meinhof terrorists, some of whose names you may know, who had murdered people and who were violent terrorists, and they were each convicted to 4 life sentences for 4 murders, whereas people in the Majdanek trial were being convicted for time served for 7 counts of 1,000 murders each. And very often when doing this research, there was sort of this response to me in Germany, which is, well, you can't compare them, they're completely different. But you can. It's the exact same criminal code. It's the same legal system. And so this continues. Of course, the culture is now starting to change, and the Demjanjuk trial is a very good example of that. I would not argue, and I think it'd be very interesting to find this out, that it's necessarily a continuity of ideology.
Rebecca, could you just give a little context for the Demjanjuk trial in case the audience doesn't know?
So John Demjanjuk, who you are very familiar with, was a Ukrainian guard at the Sobibor death camp. It took a very long time to prove this, and there were some very large, egregious errors along the way, including the fact that he was initially misidentified as Ivan the Terrible, a death camp guard from Treblinka. He was brought to Israel, put on trial, sentenced to death, the only death sentence after Eichmann, sat 9 years on death row when it was discovered that, in fact, he was not Ivan the Terrible from Treblinka, but Ivan the Less Terrible from Sobibor. It took a very long time through the work of the OSI and others to finally get him put back on trial, and he's brought to trial in Germany in 2009. Very interesting how he's brought to trial there. It's through legal wranglings which turn him into what they basically call a German civil servant because he worked for the SS. But Demjanjuk had already spent many years on death row in prison. He's then tried in Germany for aiding and abetting in the death of approximately 27,900 people at Sobibor, which are the number of people who died there in the period that he worked there. And because it was a death camp, it was assumed that he had a hand in the murder.
This is a big change then from...
It's a huge change, and it's something that Fritz Bauer wanted from the very beginning. Now, it's aiding and abetting, not perpetration of murder. But that's because there are no live witnesses who ever saw what Demjanjuk did in 2009. He's convicted. But to me, this is also a terribly problematic case of someone who had been in the Red Army, was conscribed into the Red Army, then caught, became a prisoner of war of the Germans, was trained at Travniki, which was a training camp for Ukrainian SS guards so they could do the dirty work that the Nazis didn't want to do, the Germans didn't want to do at Sobibor. I wouldn't be at all surprised if he was a terrible anti-Semite and if he deserved everything that he got. The problem is that his commander at Travniki, someone named Kurt Streibe, Travniki was not just a training camp. It also housed 6,000 Jewish prisoners who were all executed on one day in what they called the harvest after uprisings at Sobibor. His commander, Streibe, was acquitted in 1975. It's too little, it's too late. It's very, very good that it's happening, but it's too little, it's too late. The interesting thing to look at, though, is why these changes, and just briefly, these legal professionals, from what I can tell, had very fluid professional identities from the Weimar period before to the Nazi period to the period thereafter. They served their state and they served the laws of their state. They pleased their leaders. They weren't necessarily convinced Nazis afterwards. They also went after right-wing extremists, neo-Nazis. But what they did do was normalize the crimes of professionals like themselves in the legal system so that they themselves could get off the hook, and that the people who would be focused on would be the very big ones.
So I just want to ask the people who are doing this study, Christoph and Manfred, whether you would agree with in preliminary fashion, since you haven't completed your research, what Rebecca has said about this, the role of these justice ministry, justice institutional figures.
I think we couldn't agree more. I mean, you have mentioned the 68 case. We'll probably talk about that later on. But it is absolutely clear that, and that's the most interesting question, that we have lawyers here who are really top legal experts, the best people that you could find in Germany. I mean, during the 1920s and 30s, and also after 1949. They were very able people, and they served the Weimar Republic, the Third Reich, and then the Federal Republic. And the question is this part of the legal profession? Didn't they have a consciousness? Didn't they have second thoughts about what they did? I mean, these really were murderers. One can only say this. And as a lawyer, as a legal specialist, or whatever you do in this area, I mean, you should know what you are doing. And even if they were not convinced ideologically, then they should have known about their profession. And so I think it is absolutely clear that they knew what they did, and therefore it's all the more interesting why after 1949 these peoples were used again by the Federal Ministry of Justice. And then, of course, it is not surprising at all that in case of amnesty laws, or in the 68 case, here Dreher played a very important role, obviously, and I guess it was not an accident what happened there, that they really influenced not only, and that's why I also mentioned the German Bundesgerichtshof, the High Court of Germany, that they were not only in the ministry but also in the courts. And so in this case, jurisprudence also is extremely important here. How to interpret the law that has been made in the form of legislation. So even if it's particularly the first Justice Minister, Thomas Dehler, he insisted that these traditional German views about how to apply the law should be maintained. I think that was a mistake in itself at the beginning, but that was continued and is taken up by the courts, and then the interpretation ensued that you have just described, and we couldn't agree more, I think.
Yes, me too. Obviously, this is in a way also again shocking when Rebecca talks about these things. The entire behavior of the judiciary is like a big self-exoneration strategy. I would like to describe it that way. And in a sense, the Demjanjuk case is actually adding to this shame, because you have a Ukrainian that you're now putting, on the shield and saying, now look, we change the interpretation of the law and we convict concentration camp guards, and it's not even a German. So I think it doesn't do good in any ways. And we also have to see that if really the court has changed the interpretation of the law, it was a very, very small. It's not a completely new interpretation of the law. The only thing that they said is, and there had been jurisprudence before that went into the same direction in death camps. It's not in concentration camps. If you'd had the same case in Auschwitz, it would be a different story. Could be a different story. In death camps, like Sobibor, the guard must have known what was going on, and if he was standing at the door and helping that nobody could get out, he is guilty of aiding and abetting in murder. That's what the Semjano trial has said, and nothing more.
I would like to add one more thing to broaden the picture a little bit, because we become very specialists now here, and I think we should broaden the issue.
Your study is much broader than this.
If you look at the development after 1949, you can only say that it was done intentionally to use the old functional elites in order to establish the new Federal Republic of Germany. And if you look, for instance, at Article 131 of the German Constitution, and the law that was passed in 1950 by the entire German Bundestag, there were only 2 abstentions. It is clear that each civil servant in Germany who had worked for the government before 1945 had a right to apply to become a civil servant in the Federal Republic again. And this in itself makes it absolutely clear, I think, that there was a tradition of using the old elites for the new democracy.
So that raises a question for me. We've talked about the continuity between the Third Reich and the Bundesrepublik. Have you looked at all about a continuity between Weimar and the Third Reich? Are the same people in place?
Yes, of course. I mean, the Jews were driven out of office, right, from the very start on. But the others, they continued to stay. And this is what they later on said in exonerating themselves, excusing themselves by saying, oh, we stayed on in order to prevent the real Nazis from gaining power. This is what the lawyers in the law department said, right?
I just wanted to return to this because the more one does any kind of research into Nazi trials in post-war Germany, Auschwitz trial and beyond, all the way up to Demjanjuk, the more horrified you become at the problems, at the gaps. And for example, at the Majdanek trial of 15 guards from the Majdanek camp.
When was that? What year was that?
1975 till 1981. They really, dragged that one on. You see one of the defense lawyers basically making it drag on for years and years and years because he questions the objectivity of one of the expert witnesses, who is someone named Wolfgang Schäffler, who was an extraordinarily important historian of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. He says this man is biased because his doctoral supervisor was a Jew. And he actually is allowed to use this defense. And it holds everything up forever and ever and ever. 4 people are acquitted in 1979. The defense lawyers are like part of right-wing nationalist groups. And at the same time, you see the Stammheim trial going on, and there are different kinds of blocks going on, and those are the trials of the left-wing terrorists. And there, what they're doing instead is introducing retroactive law, which they would never have done for the Nazi trials, in which suddenly defense lawyers, Otto Schily being one of them, who became a very important political figure in Germany later, are suddenly barred from participating on suspicion that they have been supporting terrorist organizations. Not proof, suspicion. So you see these extraordinary contradictions. And yet, Germany, and I'm constantly dealing with this paradox, the extraordinary success of this democratic state, which was mentioned, the fact that it is a legal system that we look up to and that we really treasure and honor. There is also no country on this earth that deals with its past the way that Germany does. Who builds a memorial to its own mass perpetration of murder the size of 2 football fields in the center of its capital? Nobody. Germany does this. And so what you see, and this is where I ask myself, how can the legal system be so flawed and the process of coming to terms with the past be so complete? Well, first of all, that process comes very late. It begins really in earnest, I'd say, in the 80s and 90s and not before. And I'm starting to think it comes through the failures of the legal system rather than any successes. It comes through the frustration and anger of the next generation of intellectuals, of scholars, of politicians who say, this can't be. We can't be looking at Auschwitz and saying it's just filled with these devils and these mass murderers who aren't us. They are us. They are us. Auschwitz isn't hell. It's a German concentration camp, and we need to see it as such. And so this constant dialogue between the failures of the justice system and the success, I think, are perfectly also exemplified in a way in the minister's appearance here today, in wanting to very seriously deal with this past and the questions that are being asked by those who are doing the actual work.
So I think I'm just mindful of the time and the dinner that's waiting. I'm going to take a couple questions and we'll discuss these, and then we'll maybe pose some questions to each other. Do you think your study will have any impact on how lawyers and justice officials will be trained today, legal training? Is there any utility in what you're finding in terms of trying to guard against? Or
well, I can take this question because it's easy for me to answer, as I'm a professor of law, of criminal law. It influences my teaching, definitely. And it's actually a very important part of my teaching, not only to teach them to know what the law is, but to make them understand how the law functions and what the role of lawyers is in a system, and how responsible this job is that lawyers are doing, and what is connected to that, and how it could be misused, and the blatant misuse we have experienced in these 12 years in our own history. And this is why I'm always pointing to that. Look at what happened. Look at what lawyers were capable of doing, acting as lawyers.
But that brings up I would jokingly said, perhaps this continuity and the paradox of a successful democratic state has something to do with the legal profession, the way lawyers operate. Do you see any merit to that?
Well, obviously, lawyers function wherever you put them into, in whatever regime you have them. They just do their job. You tell them what to do, and they do it. And I mean, it sounds funny in a way, but and it's perfectly in order in a way, because it's a technique. It's a technique. But you have to have normative and moral standards, and if you forget that, you'll be a bad lawyer, and you'll at the end of the day be a very unjust lawyer, and the outcome we have seen. There are thousands of dead because of the Nazi terror judiciary. So this is what I do in my teaching, to try to make them understand that there are moral criteria that they have to internalize, and that they have to live in their legal judgments and their legal posts that they'll be dealing with.
So I have another question from the audience. Germany has created many extraordinary new laws after the war, particularly relating to anti-Semitic rhetoric, hate speech. I'm sure other new laws were created that were very strong. How does that happen in the climate you are describing in post-war Germany? So again, this paradox.
Well, the legislative process is very, very hard to evaluate because we are looking at the ministry, and the ministry is not the legislator. Parliament is the legislator. Parliament is responsible. But obviously, ministry drafts the law and explains and delivers the technique and so forth. So it's a give and take between Parliament and the Federal Ministry of Justice in this regard. And I've seen actually both. I've seen incidents in which there were very liberal ideas coming from the ministry and in a draft of new legislation, and Parliament just destroyed it. And I've seen it also the other way around, where you had rather backwards looking and restricted drafts, and Parliament liberalized it. You have it both ways. What you were alluding to, the hate speech and so forth, crimes that were connected to incidents that happened in the early 50s in Cologne and other places where you had anti-Semitic incidents, and legislation had to react, and that was the outcome in this regard.
And it's very important to note those new laws against hate speech. And another very important law that comes in 1954, which is a crime of genocide, is introduced into the penal code. It's not retroactive. and it would never be used retroactively. At the Auschwitz trial in 1963, they cannot use the 1954 genocide charge because it didn't exist during the Nazi period. So it is something that is partially also optics. It is also from the pushing of the parliament and of those people who really strongly feel that these laws need to be put in place. But those who really committed the crimes never have to answer to those particular charges.
This is a question that relates to a question that I wanted to ask, and that is, how much did the allies of Germany know about this continuity in terms of the Justice Ministry? And this raises a larger question. I haven't heard the term Cold War raised at all in all discussion, but it's certainly an important factor in all this. Can you comment?
Yeah, the Cold War was certainly very important. And Adenauer himself, Chancellor Adenauer himself, pointed out repeatedly that he had to use the old elites in order to construct a functioning democracy.
Could they have constructed a functioning justice apparatus without using these elites?
Well, we have looked into that. For instance, we asked ourselves, why didn't they use more immigrants who returned to Germany? And after all, I mean, we are dealing here with a relatively small ministry. It's the smallest ministry that exists in the Federal Republic, and we are dealing here mainly with 150 or 200 people. So, and it is hard to believe that it was completely impossible to find people who had not been affected that much by the Nazi regime. But obviously, it went the other way. And this is, by the way, not only the case in the Justice Ministry, it's the case everywhere. And Adenauer himself said, how could I, and you pointed to the Allies, how can I explain, for instance, in the military sector, how can I explain to the American president or to an American general that we have 18-year-old completely unexperienced generals in the new German army? So obviously they needed these functional elites in order to establish the new republic. But the question is, even if there was a lot of pressure due to the Cold War, due to the perceived Soviet threat, it could have been possible in many ways to have other decisions.
East Germans did it. I mean, you can call it a flawed system too, but the East Germans made sure that there were none of those. And in some ways, you could think that might be precisely one of the reasons why it didn't happen that way in West Germany. And if you also contemplate how quickly the Cold War begins, if you think of what's happening in Berlin in 1948, there is a very strong need to turn these enemies into allies.
But here I would like to step in. I do not really believe that the East German legal system was better than the West German.
No, they took a red color and painted above the brown.
Yeah.
So a couple of just echoing some of these questions, because I want to get back to the study for a moment. The study. The origins of the study, this came from the former Justice Minister before Minister Maas. It's commissioned by the ministry itself. You're independent. You have complete access to all the files that you wish to have access to.
Yes, this was extremely important for us. First of all, that this is an independent commission. That is very important. And so far, we can say we have not only full access to these files, but we also have a lot of support from the ministry. And so what we are doing here, and Minister Maas has already referred to that, we try to learn from the experience in the Auswärtiges Amt, in the Foreign Office. And that's why we try to be as transparent as possible. So we are really trying to initiate a public discourse on the German legal system and what happened with it after 1949 and also before 1945, of course. And we have held numerous conferences in various places, including the German High Court and of course academic institutions and so on. And the response by the public, especially also from the media, has been overwhelmingly positive. I think one can say that. So, of course, on the one hand, we are grateful for the support that we get. As far as the archival material is concerned, this is particularly relevant. Most of the personal files are still located in the basement of the ministry in Berlin, so that we are really privileged to have this access. But it is important, otherwise we would not be able to do this work. But in addition to looking at these personal files, we of course are also looking and examining files in the German National Archives, in the Federal Archives in Koblenz and Berlin, and in other places, of course.
Final comment on your effort?
Final comment on the study.
Yeah.
Well, it's hard to put it in a nutshell for the time being. As you know, we haven't finished the study yet. But I also must say that I'm deeply shocked on one side by the enormity of the infiltration. Secondly, I'm shocked by the way how these people helped one another. There was a real network, all through the different institutions, the courts and other ministries and so forth. And on the other hand, because I'm looking at these biographies, I always have on the edge of understanding these people, because they all have their individual stories, and there's never a black and white. There are so many different shades of gray in this area, and this makes it very, very hard for us as researchers to really present a result in that way. We cannot say it was one way or the other. It's sort of somewhere in between.
And I think when you begin to draft it, it'll be a literary challenge as well.
Absolutely.
So I am told by our hosts here that our time is up, and I'm going to display a lot of chutzpah here, and I'm going to offer on behalf of the hosts, and if they won't do it, I'll invite you to my institution. When you're finished the report, I think it would be very useful to have you all back here to discuss your final findings. I respect the undertaking that you have and the seriousness of purpose with which you are approaching it. And I respect Minister Maas and his attitude toward this and the support from the Ministry of Justice. I want to thank the audience for all of your wonderful questions, only several of which I was able to pose. But there's going to be some time out in the lobby to chat with the panelists, and I appreciate your coming out on such a cold night. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Michael Schmidt, and I'm the director of AJC New York, and I have the privilege of closing tonight's program. And I want to start by thanking each of our panelists, and particularly Justice Minister Haas, who flew here, all of them, from abroad to join us tonight. And I think a conversation like this is not only most meaningful, but I commend the German government for the work that they're doing. I learned earlier today that not only in the Justice Ministry, but in the Ministries of Interior, Finance, Economy, and Labor, similar studies are being done about Nazi involvement post-World War II. And I certainly want to invite you all to come back and share with us what your findings are. I think many questions were raised tonight, perhaps more than when we came in the room. You've given us a lot to think about, a lot to comprehend, a lot to pause and consider. I think the word paradox was raised several times, and I think that in fact does describe some of what we're experiencing and seeing. I want to thank our partners, the Leo Baeck Institute and Dr. Weitzer, for all the work that they have done. This has been really a true partnership and a labor of love, and we have very much appreciated the opportunity to work together with you and your team, and thank everyone for the work that they've done. And now I have the great pleasure to invite everyone to join us for a kosher buffet up in the Great Hall and a reception. Our speakers and panelists will remain, so you'll have a little bit of an opportunity to speak with them individually, and enjoy the evening. Thank you. Also, one last word. If you enjoyed this evening, you have cards next to you, most of you, about AJC's Global Forum in Washington, D.C., June 7th to 9th. I extend a personal invitation for you to come join us and be joined by 2,000 to 3,000 people from across the globe. We generally get 70 countries represented. Foreign ministers from all over the world have come and joined us, and this year will be no exception. So if you have any questions, please feel free to speak to any of the AJC staff members. Thank you very much.